This book is today publicly released by the Ukrainian Catholic University Publishing House. Welcome, Mr. Pirchner.
Thank you.
Glad you are with us. So today we are going to discuss the book with you. We will ask you to present the core findings of the book, and we will also invite to present some of the views. We will invite Mr. Vitaly Demyanuk, engineer and entrepreneur whose generosity made publishing of this book possible, as well as Dr. Alexandra Litvinenko, director of the National Institute of Strategic Studies, who is going to present his view as well briefly, as well as moderate the discussion afterwards. So, Mr. Pirchner, the floor is yours. We are looking forward for your presentation.
Thank you. And I want to give my thanks to everybody that was involved in bringing this book to fruition and to be published in the Ukrainian language. The whole effort, of course, at its most base level, has to do with the effects of Russian imperialism and Russian aggression throughout the world, which is a problem not first of all for Ukraine, but not only for Ukraine. There's an anti-Putin Russian that once told me, now living in exile, Putin is a man whose appetite is increased by the eating. And to the extent that American and Western policy does not fully support and defend Ukraine, it will increase the problems the West and the US in particular will have with Russia throughout the world. I think before we begin talking specifically about Putin, it's also good to note that the problem is larger than just Putin. It's a question of imperialistic culture that drives policy for Moscow. In the year 1900, I think there were only 55 sovereign countries in the world. The world was dominated by 13 empires, and the collapse of those empires is responsible for many of the world's problems today, as the former colonial powers try to influence political events and economic events in their former territories. Usually it's peaceful, usually it's economic, but not always. And there are the limitations of former colonial powers based on their military strength and their geography. For instance, there may be people in Western Europe that countries in Western Europe that wish to exercise more influence in Africa than they do, but geography plays a part. It's too far away. Or maybe some Austrians would like to have South Tyrol, which since World War I has been part of Italy back, but Austria is a small and not powerful country, and even if they had the desire, they can't do it. The problem with Russia and the former Soviet states is Russia is a strong power and they're at everybody's border. And that makes the problem enduring as long as imperialist ideology is alive. One of the great ironies, however, is that the same imperialistic instinct exists in China, which is strong and has a border on Russia, and it someday may wish to take back the Russian Far East and much of eastern Siberia, which was China until 1858 and 1860. Well, enough about that. We're here to talk about Putin and what may come after him. It may seem strange to think of a world without Putin. He's been there a long time, and not many dictators stay in power for 20 years or more. We did at the American Foreign Policy Council a study of countries of 10 million or more people that had dictatorships since World War II. And we focused, for the purpose of this presentation, especially upon those dictators that managed to stay in power 20 years or more. There were 35 of them. And of those 35, 42% were forcibly removed from office or killed. And at the time they lost power, their average age was 73. And 6 of those 15 lost power even before they were 68. Putin turned 68 this last October, and he's been in power for 20 years. I think Putin, no doubt, is and has been aware of these figures, and he has so far stayed in power because he's understood the dangers to his rule, and he successfully mitigated the threats to his power through the use of internal repression and external distractions, such as his military action in Ukraine and Syria and other foreign aggressive behavior. This has fed domestic propaganda and has built his support. But he has real problems that he is facing. And if he falls from power, you can begin to see the outlines of how it might happen. Real income in Russia has declined 5 of the last 6 years. This year, it's projected by some that real income will fall 5%. You have 53% of young Russians, 18 to 24, that would leave the country if they had a chance. You have local elites that are upset because dams they had been promised to control floods were not built because of expenditures in Ukraine and in Syria. You have an elite around Putin that is upset because they worked very hard to steal billions and now they can't spend them freely and to live freely in Western Europe. So with all that hard stolen money, they feel a little bit cramped and they wonder, well, it's nice to have, some of them wonder, maybe it's nice to be in Donbass, maybe it's nice to have Crimea, but is it worth all these restrictions and how things are causing problems? And with the income and economy going south, there certainly are people in the Russian elite that must be privately, not publicly, but privately wondering, is Putin continuing to serve their narrow interest? Is he fulfilling his obligations to them as a leader? Now, in conversations with people that are in the elite, not conversations that are held in Russia, I said, well, if you're not happy with Putin, are you going to do something? No, we have too much to lose. But then I would ask, well, what happens if he stumbles badly? The answer comes back, if he stumbles badly, all the knives will be out. There may be a movement against him. So my bottom line in terms of thinking about how stable his rule is goes back a little bit to the old Lenin formulation about from a spark, a fire will flare up. Iz ikri vazgoritsa flamya, if my language is correct. If not, forgive me. I think there is an environment that may increasingly be explosive in Russia, but it's an open question if a spark will ever come to ignite that, and if Putin's instruments of repression are strong enough to repress whatever flame may come to be. That's really an unknowable question. But what is sure is that at some point, Putin will not be there. If it's an assassination, if it's a coup, if it's a heart attack, if he simply chooses to step down and feel strong enough he can put his own person in power, at some point he will not be there. And then the question becomes, what will Russian policy be? Well, you end up with a very strong nationalist of Rogozin that becomes even more aggressive against Ukraine and other former Soviet states? Will you have a very long power struggle as you had as Khrushchev, as Stalin even began to consolidate power? Such a long struggle like that may provide a breathing room for countries on Russia's periphery, may even create the opportunity for a settlement that restores Ukrainian sovereignty. Could you end up with economic reformers of sorts that simply want to be able to be accepted in their dachas and their grand homes in Western Europe and other parts of the globe? I think that is not knowable. But what is knowable is that things, when dictators fall from power, it is often a very, very, very quick phenomenon. And if contingency plans are not made, those in other countries who will be affected by the fall from power of Putin may not be able to act quickly enough to influence events at the time where they're most subject to being influenced. And to be able to have these contingency plans, I think it's important to digest, as this book does, the lessons of the transfers of power in the post-Tsar era. I think the Tsarist era is not so applicable, because then you had to be part of the royal family to get many positions, and it's an entirely different situation during the Soviet era and during the post-Soviet era. If there becomes an open struggle among many factions, which is possible because Putin by design has not left a clear line of succession, I think it will be especially important to watch those organs in the state that have the ability to use power. During the first time there was an effort to depose Khrushchev, he was kept in power through the help of Zhukov, who was able to bring Central Committee members in. In the final analysis, the army, which may choose not to be involved, and probably will, would be decisive because they simply have more guns than anybody else if it goes to that point. And I think looking at all other instruments of power and local elites will be the key to understanding how events may unfold. And I believe the intelligentsia of Ukraine is probably better equipped to do that than those that study Russia in the West. You know the culture better, you understand the mindset better, you understand how the institutions work better. And I would hope as the months and years unfold that there would be a dialogue among your best thinkers with those in the West who I hope will learn to listen to your analysis with a very careful ear and a very thoughtful intent. And I'm hopeful that we'll have a lot of time for questions and back and forth. So maybe I will stop there and let the program go ahead, and we can pick up on things I've said or maybe haven't said in the question and answer period.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pirchner, for your presentation of the core thesis of your book. Now, let me invite to speak Mr. Vitaly Demyanyuk, an entrepreneur, engineer, and the person who made the publication of this book possible. Mr. Demyanyuk, the floor is yours, please.
Good afternoon. Good morning, Mr. Pirchner. It's a great pleasure and honor to be involved in the implementation of this project in Ukraine. Like any good book, this book not only answers questions, but I think, first of all, asks the right questions and stimulates thought. The questions were posed with necessary level of breadth of outlook and depth of study. This book expands our boundaries of strategic forecasting and allow us to abandon the static perception of reality. The factor of Russia is and will remain constant for Ukraine, as permanent as our neighborhood. We are interested in a stable and at the same time democratically developing Russia, which would go through this getting rid of imperial illusions. Asking the question of what Russia will look like after Putin and trying to build correct analytical forecasts, we are not only working towards minimizing our own possible risks, but also, I think, increasing our own subjectivity. We must be ready for those, I would say, windows of opportunities that may open when political regime in Russia changes or transforms. And at the same time, which is also emphasized in the book, it is very important to understand that many political processes in Russia are based on historical cycles and accordingly to historical patterns in which this or that political person, due to objective and subjective reasons, as well as random circumstances, fits. From my perspective, understanding these patterns, the analysis will enable us to make better predictions. Another point that I would like to note is that in conditions of unstable equilibrium that will precede a change in the political regime in Russia, it's very important to prepare in advance factors of external and external influences that can shift situation in one direction or another. And the carriers of such factors can be not only global players, but also the closest neighbors, including Ukraine. We need to be prepared, both for the fact that a period of turbulence will begin in the quite vast territory next to us, and be participants in a new proposal for Russia, which will help direct the transformation processes in a democratic, anti-imperial direction of development. So I would like to say thank you very much, Mr. Pirchner, for his book, and to invite my colleagues in Ukraine to read it. It would be interesting and very useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Demyanuk. Here I will say that publication of Mr. Pirchner's book, Post-Putin, opens up our Russia program at the Analytical Center of the Ukrainian Catholic University. Again, Mr. Demyanuk, let me express our gratitude for your support for the publication of this book.
With pleasure.
Now let me give the floor to Dr. Alexander Litvinenko, Director of the National Institute of Strategic Studies. Mr. Litvinenko, in his position of Deputy Secretary of National Defense and Security Council in 2014-19, was actually one of the shapers of Ukraine's strategy towards Russia. So, Dr. Litvinenko, please share your vision.
First of all, I am very thankful for Ukrainian Catholic University for my invitation. I am extremely thankful for publishing this very, very interesting book for post-Putin Russia. And I want to share with you some thoughts on this issue, because I think that this book First of all, is a brilliant publishing of this book is a brilliant reason for launch the discussion about Russia and Ukrainian-Russian relations in the future. First of all, I want to stress that Russia is not an enigma. Russia, we can thought about Russia, we can analyze Russia, and we can give a forecast on the future of Russia. We don't have enough information, but we should collect it, and first of all, we should listen Russians. Russians in the last 30 years became, even under the Putin, much more open in their speeches, and we should listen them and believe them. It's the first issue. The second issue, as Mr. Pirchner said, Putin is a ruler of Moscow and of Russia for more than 20 years. It's the longest rule in Russia after Stalin, who after Stalin is bigger than Brezhnev, bigger than Khrushchev, bigger than Yeltsin. And resign of Putin will be, for example, we can use all syllogisms, all people will die, Putin is a man, Putin will die. But for us, much more interesting, not Putin as a man, as a human being, but Putin as a symbol of Russian system. And after the Putin design, this system will try to produce itself in the future, to continue its existence. Too many depends from how Putin will resign. If it will be suddenly or not. If it will be prepared resign or not. I do believe that the system tries to find the successor and prepare him. And now we can see that find down process is ongoing. Mr. Pirchner said about many candidates for successor, but the process is ongoing still. And I don't think that this man or woman, I think preferably a man, will be representative of the Federal Security Service or some other power structure. It could be quite young and quite successful technocrat, so-called system liberal, or entrepreneur, or somebody else who will fill some criteria. He will be open for the system. He will be one of them, and he will continue the life of this system. In the case of Southern, as a cousin said, we can say about many scenarios, but personally, I think that Russian system, Russian so-called vertical, it's quite powerful for keeping the situation calm and continuation the current process. Right now, what will be in 5 months, in 1 year, nobody knows. I am saying about current situation. I want to stress the next issue. Russian constitution and the experience after the fall of the Soviet Union said us that the ruler of Russia must win election. It's of course manageable election. It's not free election, but it's election. It means that this guy should say what people want to listen. It means that he will say what is good for society. And if we read Russian newspaper, and not only Russian news, but Russian internet, we see what Mr. Pincher names Russian imperial culture. My strong belief that Putin is not a leader, he is an opportunist. He is not lead Russian society, but it follows for feeling of majority of Russian society. And the next, his successor will do the same. First of all, on the first part of his rule. The very important, the first years of his for his time in the Kremlin, the new leader of Russia will work first of all on domestic issues, because he should to consolidate his power, his power, and create a strong system. For Putin, it took 4 years. For Yeltsin, it took 5 years. For Khrushchev, it took 3 years, etc. Of course, Russia will correct its foreign policy. It changed in some way. But I don't believe that, first of all, in the few next years, it will be very radical changes. Russians don't want a big war. They will try to find out some answer for more peaceful, more friendly relations with the big European states, with the EU, with the US. But they will not radically change its Russian policy toward the neighbors of Russia, because in whole, for many Russians, current policy toward Ukraine is pretty okay. From my point of view, the changes of foreign policy will be very, very gradual. And if we are saying about Ukrainian case, definitely Russia will not try to, will not discuss the issue of returning of Crimea. And even Russian oppositioner, such as Navalny, said that Crimea is not a bread and butter. It's not a hamburger. And it's very, very important to understand. Maybe could be a changes toward Donbass. We should be ready for these changes. We should prepare some plans, and very detailed plans, including the security and defense sphere. We should understand that we have to prepare for many scenarios in Donbass, in Crimea, in Russia. But first of all, we want to understand the probability of Russian dissolution for right now is not so high. And we must, I strongly stress, we must to find out some modality for coexisting with Russia. In the future, I hope, peaceful coexistence. And this is the main modality of this coexisting: Ukrainian state sovereignty and freedom of hand for close and close relation with the West, and joining the NATO and European Union. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Litvinenko. Now let me ask you to moderate the question and answer session.
Okay, thank you so much. We are open for your questions, dear colleagues. Please.
Hello, Mr. Pirchner. Thank you for this book. You have not explained your vision, but as far as I understand, you are more Republican than Democrat. This is very much important for the future of Ukraine, much more important than our views of when Putin dies or who will be his successor. To my mind, the situation for Ukraine would be better if Ukraine is strong enough militarily, and to be strong militarily, Ukraine has to be strong economically, which does not happen in the last 30 years. So my question is, do you speculate on the hypothesis of changing American attitude as a power which is interested in something to happen here in Ukraine? You have your interests in this area of the world in changing economic policy, because this neoliberal policy which we have here does not allow to develop a strong economy and does not allow to support military bases and to defend democratic values and to defend European and total North Atlantic world if the empire after Putin would start to die and fighting in this process. Thank you.
All right. First, your point was about me being a Republican, which is correct. But I want to emphasize there is very strong support among both Republicans and Democrats for Ukraine. And that is enduring, and it will make little difference who is in the White House in terms of getting support from Congress. And I think in general, the more Americans know about Ukraine, the stronger the support will be. To the extent that there is less than totally favorable viewpoints from some people, usually it comes out of ignorance, and that's something that we need to fight with ongoing discussion and debate internally in the U.S. And I think regarding economic evolution of Ukraine, it's also a question of knowledge. You have maybe 1 million people working in Ukrainians working in Poland, maybe another 1 million in Western Europe. Many of your business people travel, and I think it's understood the benefits of an open and market economy, and especially as generations change and the knowledge base is widened, I have full confidence that you're going to have a roaring economy in Ukraine, a great growth. You're a gifted people, and when the system is right, I think it's going to have enormous growth. There were two things I saw that came up on the chat that I'd like to address. Somebody had asked what I saw in terms of the future of other countries bordering Russia. I go back to 1991 when Solzhenitsyn addressed the Russian Duma and talked about the greater Slavic state that he envisioned, which would be Belarus, Ukraine, and northern Kazakhstan. And I think that vision is still alive with many in the Putin circles, especially Dmitry Rogozin, who in his book that was published in the mid-1990s talked about it didn't matter how long it took. There has to be unity like Germany had after 40 years. And this illusion of welcoming Slavic brotherhood from Ukraine, I think, has faded some, but there are nationalists in Russia, as you all know, that still aspire to the expansion of the Russian state, and that's something that's going to be a problem for some years. Another person on chat asked about peace. I think while Putin is in power, it's going to be very difficult, and I just hope that everybody is strong enough to say no to any deal that does not preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. At some point, that will become possible, in my judgment. It may not be possible while Putin's in power.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much. First of all, we are very thankful for expression of the support for Ukraine. It's extremely valuable for us. And we will continue our discussion. Dear colleagues, please. Do you have some questions? Are you ready for raise some issues, etc.? If not, we are trying to continue with some questions which were raised our interviewers. And first of all, what do you, dear Christians, dear colleagues, what do you think? Is it possible dissolution of Russia with a civil war in this country in the few next years?
The sound wasn't very good. Could the question be repeated?
Sorry. Is it possible the dissolution of Russia in the few next year and Russian civil war?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm still not hearing.
I will repeat. Is it possible that Russia's dissolution happens in a couple of next years and a civic war starts in Russia?
I think it's impossible to predict something like civil war. I think the most I will say is that I think it is perhaps a pre-revolutionary condition, and you never know when a spark sets it off. I think of when the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, the improbable spark was a street vendor that set himself on fire. Nothing organized, just an individual act, and the pent-up emotions and frustrations just exploded. And to the extent that you have big upheaval in Russia, I think it may be something unpredictable like that brings people into the streets. Now, if they come to the streets, you still need somebody from the top to lead, which means some division in the force ministries. But is such a thing possible? Yes. Can you predict or even assign a percent? I don't think so.
Let me read the next question from those people who are watching us online and send the questions via chat. Why does the West believe that a possible disintegration of Russia is bad?
Possible disintegration of Russia?
Disintegration of Russia is bad. Not good, but bad.
I think there are people in the West that like order and do not like things that are unpredictable. Having said that, you have 20% of the Russian population that are not Russian. You have regions that do not want to be part of Russia. The Caucasus, there are problems in Baskertia. You go to places in Kazan where they would prefer to be independent. There's people that look for independence in the Russian Far East, research-rich areas that would like to keep their wealth and not send it to Moscow. I think there's serious question if Russia stays as big as it is, if you want to look over a time period of 10, 20, 30 years. As indicated earlier, I think they have enormous problem with the Chinese. Just to recap history for those of you who may not know it, in the 17th century, there was what's now Eastern Siberia and the Russian Far East was mostly Aboriginal territory with trappers coming from Russia and from China, and they began fighting with each other. And finally, the Russian fort was completely destroyed, several thousand killed, and the resulting treaty of 1689, Treaty of Nerchinsk, ceded all that land to China. Russia took it in 1858 and 1860. The Chinese have not forgotten that at all. You almost had a war over that territory in the late 60s on Damansky Island, and it's my judgment at some point the Chinese will look to take that back, maybe by demographic conquest as opposed to war. If immigration from China is not controlled, what happens if you have 10 million Chinese in Primorsky Krai, where you have more Chinese than Russians? Then is it China or is it Russia? So I think there is a problem of disintegration in Russia, and I think Western response may be mixed. I don't think the West in general would like to see China grow. There may be more sympathy towards other independence movements.
Mr. Demjanjuk, if I may ask your opinion on the question asked.
Thank you for the question. Can you hear me? I don't think that we are very much interested in Russian disintegration, because we remember from our own history that any situation in Russia, any revolution situation in Russia, had huge and negative impact on Ukraine. So when someone thinks that disintegration of Russia will help us, I would recommend to think that these big pieces could create a lot of damage for us as well. So we are much more interested in keeping Russia in democratic order and be integrated as much as possible to North Atlantic culture and European culture.
If Russia is democratic and free market, then good relations are possible.
That's true.
That's exactly the next question. How do you think when and how might some kind of reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia happen? When, under which circumstances, and within which time span?
I think the prerequisite is a really democratic Russia. If there is democracy, democracies tend not to start wars against other democracies. And a stable democratic Russia would ensure, or certainly raise the probabilities of peace with Ukraine and its other neighbors.
There is a question on how expensive would it be for the West to rehabilitate Russia after Putin, if there is a change?
If there is a chance for a truly democratic Russia, a truly non-imperialistic Russia, I think a lot of help would be forthcoming. And hopefully it would be better channeled than the help that came in the 90s, which was not especially constructive.
Would you like to add, Mr. Demeniuk?
Yes, thank you. I think that Russia has enough resources, natural resources and people resources to spend for democratic changes. And if Russia will step away from imperialistic road, it will be win-win. It will not be expenses. It will be quite good business for Russia and for Western countries and for neighbors as well.
The biggest help that the U.S. could give would be what they gave to China, which is opening up the market. So if things get to be produced, they can be sold.
Could you please elaborate on the question of who might be the next potential leaders of Russia? How do you see them, and maybe how it is possible to identify and to reach out to them?
I think you can identify very powerful people in Russia that have no chance to be president, but those that have a lot to lose are now trying to grow young politicians to get them in positions as governors, as ministers. And I think I would look at the younger people coming up that have support of the wealthy, that have support of the various institutions. Do they have an FSB background? Do they have connections with the army? Do they have a strong base of regional elites? And I would begin to look there. But remember how few people were able to pick Putin's rise to power. Somebody can come that you don't see.
There is a question from the audience. It will be asked by Ivan Plahuta, who actually interpreted the book.
Huh?
Мікрофон прошу включати. Ні, наступна кнопка.
Hello everybody, I'm glad to be here with you and thank you all for this brilliant book, Mr. Pirchner, Ostap asked a very interesting question about who might be the next ruler. I like to read about Russia, about Russian culture, history, and there is a saying of a famous Russian diplomat, Churchill, умом Россию не понять. Russia cannot be understood by reasoning. But there is one succession of rulers, one law of succession that is quite like a great Russian mystery wrapped in enigma. But it's almost joke, but it's true in a way. So I dare to say that the next Russian ruler will be hairy. He has a lot of hair on his head. Putin is not hairy. Medvedev was. Before him, Putin again hairy. Not hairy. Medvedev hairy. Yeltsin hairy. Gorbachev not. Then Chernenko hairy. Andropov not. Brezhnev hairy. Khrushchev not. Stalin hairy. Lenin not. Nicholas I hairy. Alexander III not. So it's a consequence which is present for almost a century, maybe even more. So it's my revealing to our American colleagues.
it would be funny to see how behavioral bold makes for the policy implications. Let me ask another question from the list. Successful dictatorships, do they exist? And if so, looking into the perspective of a successful dictatorial Russia, how do you see it, whether it's possible or not? Please.
You can have autocratic rulers that suit their times, but what comes next? You have serial good leaders that are dictators? No. If you don't have a peaceful way to get rid of them, sooner or later it comes to bad ends. An individual one may exist, but to rule a country over a period of generations with successive dictators, there's not a good history of that whatsoever. So I think when you're looking at successors to Putin, it's going to be hard to judge in some respect what their policies would be. Who would guess that Khrushchev would have made such a big break with Stalin, having been part of that inner circle for so long? Who would have thought that after Andropov, you would have a movement towards Gorbachev? Whoever follows in a dictatorship, for good or bad, is probably not completely predictable, if only for the simple reason that nobody will speak freely to the number one person if they disagree. They'll keep their mouth shut until the time comes when they can act independently, if that time comes.
Let me ask Mr. Demjanjuk to elaborate on this. You wrote an article for Дзеркало тижня on the specifics of the Russian governing of the country, especially in times of COVID. And there were interesting remarks about the psychology of the Russian leadership. Could you please share it with us?
Russia is, from my opinion, Russia is still in the imperialistic period of their history. And this sickness should be passed by the country, by the nation. And during this imperial period, the rulers of Russia, unfortunately, for the nation and for the country, they did not consider people on their territory as really like their own nation. It was just a resource.
Yeah.
And this is a big problem for Russia as a country and for Russians as a nation. And unfortunately, till that moment, the nation, the Russians, in my opinion, from my point of view, they don't know really what is the freedom when they can open their positive features as a nation and to develop themselves. They have only remembering about how difficult is the first phase of freedom. And after that, in a very short period of time, they became again after some kind of dictatorship. With this kind of history, it's very easy to manipulate people every time, describe them the story that freedom and democracy is something bad. Because they did not have opportunity to go through a little bit deeper and to feel how fruitful the democracy could be in real.
Thank you, Mr. Demjanjuk. And Mr. Pirchner, would you like to add?
Well, I agree with that, and would only highlight the effective role of internal Russian propaganda. It used to be they would say their system is better, but a lot of the propaganda is, well, all systems are bad. Look how bad the West is. Look what's wrong here. Look what's wrong there. So that's just how life is, and accept it. And I think to the degree they believe they can make nothing true. If you believe in nothing, then you fight for nothing. So The propaganda, as you mentioned, Vitaly mentioned, plays into the culture and has been unfortunately successful. I have hope. It's the inability to control the internet usage of young Russians and the fact that travel is still there. So it's much harder to shut off that part of the Russian citizenry that can have an effect on policy from fact. The facts may be distorted, they may still be lied to, but they at least understand better that they're being lied to, and some facts come true. So with generational changes, you may have the possibility of political changes.
Thank you, Mr. Pirchner. I have the very last question, which was asked in the pre-registration letter by some of the people who are now present online. And I would like to ask this question to all our three speakers with Mr. Pirchner concluding. So the question is, how can Ukraine influence the transformation processes in Russia now and after Putin? First, I will ask Dr. Litvinenko to answer this question, then Mr. Demyanuk, and then Mr. Pirchner, I would ask you to conclude.
Thank you so much. From my humble opinion, is that we have only one opportunity to influence Russia in this situation by our example. If we became quite successful, first of all, economically, it will give Russians much more opportunities to elect Democrat, to change system in democratic way. If we continue to be not very successful economically, if we continue to be a bad example for Russians from Russian propaganda point of view, we will help Putin in this way, Putin and his successor in this way. Again, I strongly believe that only one way to help Russia to become democratic, to change itself, to become successful, democratic, economic and prosperous country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Litvinenko. Mr. Demyanuk, what do you think?
I partly agree with Dr. Litvinenko because it's quite difficult in the circumstances of war to demonstrate economical success. So, first of all, we need to survive. We need to survive as a country, as a nation. We need to save and develop our democratic tradition. We demonstrate already almost 30 years that in the post-Soviet country, in Ukraine, there could be elections, there could be revolutions. Our president changed, and we will change them again and again. And this is the first example for Russia that democracy is possible, and the country can live. The second, we need to build institutions, because yes, when we are in the situation of war, when we are under aggression of Russia, we can be economically successful, we can be economically strong, but we can have problem with this. But still, we can build institutions inside our country, and as soon as the pressure of war will be taken off, it will allow us to grow economically very quickly. So by ourselves, we are a good example for Russia and for Russian nation, for Russia, that it's possible to live in the other way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Demyanuk. Mr. Pirchner, we would like to hear your opinion on how Ukraine can offer some transformative agenda for Russia, how Ukraine can influence Russia.
Well, I think both speakers are correct to say it's by example, and Ukraine is unique that way because if you're Russian, Western Europe seems too far removed, but if you're in Russia and see success from Ukraine, if Ukraine can do it, why can't Russia do it? So I think your example as it's built is the most powerful one that can be an engine of change in Russia. And to have the idea of mass faith is sometimes stronger than reality, because if enough people begin to believe a change towards democracy, a change towards a vibrant economy are possible, then the very numbers begin to make that reality possible. So as Ukraine begins to succeed more and more, there's a great effort should be made to tell the Ukrainian story to as many of the Russian people as possible. And I think probably the internet will be the biggest way to do that and travel. So if Russia changes, I have no doubt that Ukraine will be a major region.
Thank you very much for your remarks. And let me finalize this presentation of the book of Mr. Herman Pirchner, the Junior. Mr. Pirchner, thank you very much for finding time. We know how busy you are, and thank you really for sharing your insights and your opinion with the Ukrainian audience. So this publication is held by the Ukrainian Catholic University Analytical Center, and it will be a very valuable instrument for our future future discussions on Russia, on regional and global security. Here again, let me express gratitude to Mr. Demyanuk for supporting the publication, as well as for Mr. Litvinenko for finding time joining us in this important discussion. Also, let me express gratitude to our informational partner, Ukrainian State Informational Agency, Ukrinform, who provided us with the premises and helped us with the broadcast. We will be very much looking forward for our future meetings, and maybe at the end you would like to say a couple of words, Mr. Pirchner.
Yes, well, my thanks go out to everybody that made that possible, and to Vitaly Demyanuk, of course, you're the main sponsor, and thank you. And I appreciated your opening comments. You raised the worth of the book in part by the questions that are answered. And I believe that the answers, many of them will be best made in Ukraine, again, because of your knowledge of your neighbors. And as you find them and write about them, we hope to see some of the writings translated into English and circulated among those of us in the United States and other parts of the West. And we hope to see some of you coming through Washington at some time. It would be a pleasure.
Thank you for your words. So the event is concluded. Thank you.
Thank you.